Hello, I hope everyone is doing great this morning. My name is Gary Gann and I am a procurement counselor at Tribal Government Institute PTAC located in Norman, Oklahoma. This webinar is a continuation of our discussion regarding DoD's Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, otherwise known as CMMC. Today's webinar is aimed towards introducing how to handle controlled unclassified information. You won't have to worry about taking screenshots of the slides because I will post them on our website for you to download. I'll also post the webinar video to YouTube so you can watch the webinar if you want to hear something that I said again. Our website is tgiok.com, and the on-demand video links as well as the presentation slides are located on the upcoming events page. You can also call us at 405-329-5542 if there's something that you want to talk about. Today's agenda. We're going to start with a quick update from the CMMC accreditation body and then go through the main topic, which is aimed at taking a closer look at how to approach and handle controlled unclassified information, or CUI. We'll go over a few key takeaways and we'll have some time for questions at the end of the discussion. Most of the points of discussion today were originally presented by the director of the CMMC accreditation body. Let's begin with an update regarding the CMMC accreditation body. There is not an official CMMC go live date established at this point in time. The reason for that is CMMC is still going through the federal rulemaking process, and that process will be open for public comment in Q4 2020. They will then have to reconcile the public comments, and then the CMMC go live date will be announced. However, it is expected that CMMC will go live early in Q1 of 2021. As soon as the rule has been written into law in the FAR, we will start seeing the requirements in DoD contracts. There was chatter that CMMC will be staggered in over time. However, the truth is that there are many contracting officers out there for the different services divisions that are raring to go as soon as CMMC is added to the FAR. I'm hearing that the military services will most likely add the requirements to contracts as soon as the requirements become law. This mandate is moving fast, and you should expect to see the requirement in DoD contracts in Q1 of 2021, especially for larger contracts aimed at prime contractors. The CMMC assessment guide criteria is in the final reconciliation process with DoD, and we have been told the official CMMC assessment guide is on track to be released in early October 2020, and we will make sure you receive a copy as soon as it's available to the public. If you feel like you absolutely need a guide now, you can use the NIST 800-171A guide to get you going. 110 of the 130 controls are directly from NIST 800-171, which represents 92% of the practices, and these practices are exactly the same word for word. The second set of mock assessments have been completed, and there were lessons learned by the CMMC AB that will help enhance the training program content if you want to be a registered CMMC professional for your company. You can go to cmmcab.org to learn about the different roles that are available. As I mentioned, the federal rulemaking process is occurring at this very moment and will end in late Q4 2020. There weren't any other major updates provided by the CMMC AB, but they are at the tail end of this thing, and they are working as fast as they can with the federal rulemakers to get this into law. Why are we going through all of this? The reality is hundreds of billions of dollars in operational technology integration within the cyberspace arena has been stolen by our adversaries, and the U.S. defense industry technical data continues to be at extreme risk. Cybersecurity compromise is the greatest and most egregious threat to the national security of the country in the history of our country, hands down. As we've learned the hard lessons in our personal lives about things like our credit cards being compromised, our personal data being compromised, and even identity theft, we are now transitioning those hard-learned lessons to manufacturing and into the defense industrial supply chain. Imagine on an epic and catastrophic scale, our adversaries are literally stealing the warfighting capability of our soldiers, sailors, Marine Corps, and airmen and women, as well as our ability to protect them. Our adversaries do this by stealing our intellectual property, and they are absolutely stealing the potential future from our children and grandchildren. This is not hyperbole, it is not exaggeration. Data compromise is happening this very second I am speaking to you. This happens every second of every minute of every hour, 7 days a week, and it will continue to happen until we begin to implement these controls. It is egregious, and our national security has been damaged, and we have to do something to stop it. So this is not compliance for compliance sake, and that is really important to understand. It is not protecting the data just so Uncle Sam can get into your pocketbook and make a bunch of new rules that you have to follow. These rules are there really to protect our national security interests and your company's interests through your company's ability to compete in this global economy by safeguarding your intellectual property. The US government was forced to react, and they came up with these rules that you may now be familiar with, which are NIST 800, 171, and DFARS, which are currently in effect to standardize the handling of controlled unclassified information and federal contract information, as well as documents and manufactured parts. These rules are intended to provide the defense industrial base with the cybersecurity guidelines that will allow our country to meet and sustain the needed safeguarding requirements. The US government also requires that cybersecurity incidents be reported in 72 hours, which can be difficult to do. We're about to get into the handling of CUI, and if you missed the first webinar regarding what CUI is, then you are welcome to go to our website, tgiok.com, and click on the upcoming events link, where you will find our webinar archive, and you can watch any of the webinars that you missed. We also upload all of the slides to the archive for you to download so you can have them. The reason I harp on the path to compliance, even though CMMC is coming soon, is because DFARS 7012 has been in place for several years now. If you currently handle CUI and are under a DoD contract, then you are required to meet DFARS 7012 right now, and you have been for the last 3 years. Self-attestation, checking that box saying you're compliant is the easy part. The hard part is that if you check the box and are not compliant, because that puts you in jeopardy and at risk for the False Claims Act, and that is not something that you want coming down on you. The Department of Justice has been going after companies that self-attested that they are compliant with DFARS 7012 but aren't. I need to emphasize that the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, or ITAR data, is a form of CUI and falls under DFARS 7012. ITAR, or export control data, is without a doubt the highest risk to you. ITAR has robust and highly technical compliance requirements, and you should not treat the ITAR requirements lightly. ITAR penalties and possible censure are serious. The penalty for failure to adhere to ITAR compliance can be $1 million per incident, and that means per document. If you need any assistance with ITAR, be sure to let us know so we can help support you through it. The reason I bring this up is because with respect to your risk and security assessment, you need to understand both sets of risks. What are the risks under DFARS 7012 with respect to controlled technical information underneath CUI, and the other portion of CUI, which is ITAR data? Just make sure you understand what ITAR data is so you will know whether you need to take extra caution when handling it. The risk and security assessment is an annual requirement. The plan of action and milestones, or POAM, comes from your risk and security assessment, and you need to have one because that is your get well plan, so to speak. Your system security plan is derived from both of those documents, and that is your roadmap from DFARS 7012 to CMMC. It should seamlessly integrate into your export control requirements along with your technology control plan and export administration regulations, or EAR. All these documents have to be 100% completed and be in conformity by the time that CMMC third-party assessors come to visit you. These documents are important because they are the foundation for CMMC compliance. We are going to reflect on these things as we go through DFARS 7012 and CMMC with regard to CUI authorization, determination, and marking. The government policy underneath DFARS, the CFR, and ITAR requires that you properly mark, control, and safeguard controlled unclassified information. So what is controlled unclassified information? It is the information that the United States government requires you to protect under various types of federal law, specifically NIST 800-171, which is covered by DFARS 7012. CUI has 24 categories and is listed in the CUI registry, so you can go to the National Archives and Records Administration, or NARA, where they have a CUI registry page, and it will give you all the categories and definitions associated with CUI. The NARA CUI registry is a principal resource that will help guide you on how to identify and handle CUI, and I will provide a link to NARA in one of the slides at the end of the discussion. CUI is information the federal government requires you to handle and protect in a very specific way, and CUI requires dissemination controls. There are a couple of categories of CUI you may encounter. There is basic CUI and specified CUI, but that isn't important in the beginning. But what is important is that there are foundational basic requirements that you have to meet in order to properly protect controlled unclassified information. And that is underneath an executive order through the National Archives and Records Administration as the executive agent. The CUI policy is also under 32 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 2002. You don't have to become an expert in 32 CFR Part 2002. You just need to know that that is where this law exists so you can become familiar with it. Fundamentally, there are 24 categories of CUI, 92 subcategories of CUI, and 110 different types. So it can be difficult to navigate, but we can help you identify what is CUI and what is not. The determination process for marking CUI is really important and is really the first step, so it will be a priority. What is designating CUI? Designating CUI occurs when an authorized holder, it could be you, consistent with 32 CFR Part 2002.4 and the CUI registry, determines that a specific item of information falls into a CUI category or subcategory. What that means is when a piece of information or even a part that you have is CUI, you have to ask yourself, is this CUI? If you determine that that piece of CUI or if that piece of information or part is CUI, then you have to ask yourself, now what do I have to do? Well, it is your responsibility to mark or make sure it is properly marked. In this simplified example, you have made a determination that the information or part is CUI, and you have ensured it was properly marked. That is designating CUI. Now, the authorized CUI holders, and that includes you, DoD, the prime contractors, have the responsibility for marking CUI, and there is no ambiguity or uncertainty about that. You must make CUI recipients aware of the fact the information or part you're giving them is CUI. If you receive information or part that meets the definition of CUI, then it is CUI, whether it was previously properly marked as CUI or not. The reason you have to determine its CUI and properly mark CUI as being CUI is because you have to do that before you give it to someone else inside your company or even outside of your company. So wait. Someone said, I was authorized to handle CUI because someone gave CUI to me under this contract. Well, who within my organization is authorized for me to give it to them? And that really is a great question. The rules underneath 32 CFR Part 2002.4 and expressed in DoD policy, which is DoD Instruction 5200.48, it's there at the bottom of the screen, says that no individual may have access to CUI information unless it is determined he or she has an authorized lawful government purpose. What does that mean? That means when I get a contract from the federal government through DoD and I receive CUI to execute the contract, or if I create CUI as part of the performance of the contract, then it makes me authorized to have a lawful government purpose. However, suppose I have a commercial entity where I have DoD contract projects going on, and I have my general commercial projects going on. Can the commercial engineers working on my commercial projects have access to the CUI information just because they are curious? The answer to that is no. So within your organization, you have to be able to separate who should have access to CUI based on their job duties and expertise. This also includes when should someone have access to CUI. An employee should only have access to CUI if they specialize in something that uses CUI or they are operating a machine that is creating CUI. For example, an engineer working on an engineering diagram for a part going into a military application should not necessarily have access to the DoD provided technical specifications your CNC machine operator uses to manufacture a completely different part. You really have to think through who and when an employee should have access to CUI. Making the determination of authorized holders. I know I've touched on this, but there's a bit more to talk about. You must have a lawful government purpose, which we saw in DoD Instruction 5200.48. No individual may have access to CUI information unless it is determined he or she has an authorized lawful government purpose. I know you may be thinking, how do you receive lawful government purpose? And to be honest with you, that is an excellent question. Let's phrase the question this way. Suppose I have a LLC where I do both government contracting work and commercial work. I was just awarded a new DoD contract for a military end assembly that requires CNC machining. How do I officially authorize an employee to have lawful government purpose? I have a commingled manufacturing line where I am doing DoD work and commercial work. The first thing you do is you say, these folks here are going to participate in performing this DoD contract because they are the ones that have the expertise to perform the necessary work. So I make a list in my access control policy that says these employees are authorized to access CUI. However, I do not want to grant these employees access to the CUI until I have trained them or sent them to training on properly handling and safeguarding of CUI. Once you have identified what employees are absolutely necessary in performing the contract, officially list and have officially listed those employees in the access control policy and provided safeguarding and handling training to these designated employees, then they can be handed the CUI packet so they can begin work, as they would now have a lawful government purpose. There currently isn't a certification for handling or safeguarding CUI, so you just have to make sure the employees know they are working with CUI and that they know how to handle and safeguard the CUI. DoD 5200.48 contains sections that go over this in more detail, and I will include a link to DoD 5200.48 in a couple of the slides. You must determine others' access to CUI. So the person with authorized possession, knowledge, or control of CUI will determine whether an individual has authorized lawful government purpose to access designated CUI. It is your responsibility, just like it is a responsibility of your prime contractor or the DoD contractor or officer or manager, to determine you as the authorized CUI holder, and it is your responsibility as a recipient of CUI who else is an authorized holder, whether they are employees inside of your company or even entities outside of your company, such as subcontractors or vendors that support you meeting the requirements for the contract. And this would apply to even a repair person that is repairing your CNC machine, or maybe you have one of those KUKA robotic arms that needs to be repaired. The repair person has to access the CNC machine or KUKA robot, and they have access to CUI. So now you have to make a determination that the repair person now has a lawful government purpose to access that CUI environment, because the parts and pieces that machines create or deal with is CUI. So when you have to do that, you are disseminating CUI. You are providing CUI access to individuals that you have determined to be authorized holders. DoD policy says that CUI information may be disseminated within the DoD components and between DoD component officials and DoD contractors, consultants, and grantees to conduct official business for the DoD, provided dissemination is consistent with controls imposed by a distribution statement or limited dissemination controls. This just means that individuals that have been determined to have official business as being an integral component in the effort of performing DoD contracts can access CUI. However, there is a reasonable expectation rule for CUI. The reasonable expectation rule says that before you grant access to CUI, the grantee of CUI must have knowledge and understanding of the responsibilities associated with accessing CUI. If the grantee of CUI does not have knowledge and understanding of the responsibilities of how to handle and safeguard CUI, then it is your responsibility to make sure they receive the proper training. It is your responsibility as a recipient of CUI to ensure your employees, subcontractors, and others fully understand the basic CUI handling and safeguarding requirements. You might say, well, this has already happened because we didn't even know about all this. We have already passed CUI down to our subcontractors through our terms and conditions, and our subcontractors are currently handling the CUI. What that means is you now have a sense of urgency because you're violating 32 CFR and DoD policy. The deadline for all of this was technically 3 years ago with NIST 800-171 underneath DFARS 7012. And that is why the risk associated with the False Claims Act is real. If I self-attest that I'm compliant with DFARS 7012 and I tell my prime contractor that everything is good and I am compliant, but by the way, none of my subcontractors that we hand CUI over to in order to execute their portion of the work are not compliant. Well, I have just violated the reasonable expectation rule under 32 CFR Part 2002.16 and the DoD policy. I would also be breaking these two rules if I hand CUI over to an employee that has not been trained on how to properly handle and safeguard CUI. You might think that you don't have any CUI because you don't see anything marked as being CUI. Unfortunately, that is not true. Well, you might say it's the government's responsibility to mark CUI as being CUI, and that is very true. Or it's the prime contractor's responsibility to mark CUI as being CUI, and that is true as well. The reality is that it's your responsibility to mark CUI as being CUI as well. It is currently rare for a CUI document to be properly marked, And that is one of the objectives of CMMC. That is one of the reasons we are going through all of this. The government is trying to ensure that all CUI is properly marked because they know that we, as government contractors that possess all this critical information, have not done a great job at properly marking and safeguarding CUI. There are many documents out there in the field that have partial markings that say controlled, or just have ITAR markings, or just an ITAR distribution statement for export control, or just have distribution statements on them. And there are all sorts of variants of failed attempts to properly mark CUI, and that is what the US government is trying to clean up. So 32 CFR Part 2002.16 states, prior to disseminating CUI, the authorized holders must label CUI according to marking guidance issued by the CUI Executive Agency, ISO marking guidance, and must include any specific markings required by law, regulation, or government-wide policy. I included a link on the slide that will take you to the official NARA ISO marking guide. And this document goes into great detail on how to properly mark CUI. Keep in mind that you also need to follow the guidance contained in DoD I 5200.48. I encourage you to download the ISO marking guidance PDF and go through it, as well as review DoD I 5200.48 and let us know what questions that you have. What if CUI is not properly marked? 32 CFR Part 2002.20 is directly in line with NARA guidance and DoD guidance, and it states that the lack of CUI marking on information that qualifies as CUI does not exempt the authorized holder from abiding by applicable handling requirements as described in the order, this part, and the CUI registry. So if CUI is not properly marked and you receive it, you then have the responsibility to determine its CUI and properly mark the CUI as being CUI before you can disseminate it. You have to do all of this in the beginning, and that's why knowing this process is important. Okay, let's go through an example here. We have an engineering diagram that was given to us by our customer, who is a military or space contractor with the US government. And I know the drawing is for the DoD program. I also know they passed down the wording and the terms and conditions to include the DFARS 7012 clause. The contracting officer sent me the form to self-attest that I am DFARS 7012 compliant, and I checked the box and I sent it back to them saying that I am compliant. The technical drawing on the left is part of the technical data that is associated with the DoD contract and the DFARS 7012 clause. However, the drawing is missing the majority of the proper CUI markings. What do I need to do? Under DoD policy, I can either mark the drawing as CUI/SP-CTI or as controlled as per DoD I 5200.48. I need to properly cover it with a cover sheet, just like the ones you can find on CUIsupply.com or the GSA. I need to restrict the area around where the CUI is being stored so I can create what is referred to as a controlled environment. I need to put banner markings on any computers that have access to CUI, store CUI, use a CUI as input for additional processes, or creates output from the CUI, and even just simply if it displays CUI. I need to add a monitor screen to any computer monitors that display CUI as well. I have to make sure my engineers that have been authorized to handle CUI know to use this particular machine when working with CUI. And I need to make sure that my non-authorized employees do not use machines that have been designated and marked to utilize CUI. Let's move on to export controlled information. What is export controlled information? Export controlled information is the information that you are most likely to encounter or see. Export controlled information is a category of CUI, and the requirement for EXPT. They're highly technical and you don't want to get them wrong. You also want to make sure that the ITAR distribution restriction statement is present on the document. But if you cannot add anything to the document, then you will want to add one of those cover sheets to the document and make sure the cover sheet always moves along with the document. Under the export controlled information requirements, you do not want foreign entities to gain access to the information, and that is why all these markings are so important. So I have determined that I, as a U.S. citizen, have a lawful government purpose to be an authorized holder of CUI because the document is part of a DoD contract I was awarded. My company has green card holders working on the manufacturing line as engineers that operate CNC machines. Because they are green card holders, they are also U.S. persons, and under the defined export control requirements, green card holders can be authorized holders of export controlled information once they have been added to my access control policy and completed the CUI safeguarding and handling training. Suppose I have a maintenance person or an advisor from a foreign country and they are not a U.S. citizen or green card holder. They cannot access export controlled information, and there are egregious penalties if you allow that to happen. So I'd want to determine what kind of CUI information I am dealing with. In this case, I'm dealing with export controlled information CUI. I have to then ask myself who is able to access this kind of CUI information. In this case, only U.S. citizens can access this export controlled information. Only U.S. persons that have a lawful government purpose are able to access it. This means only the U.S. persons directly associated with the execution of the terms of the DoD contract are authorized to access it. I also have to ensure that I meet all of the requirements associated with the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, or ITAR. And this is not just the technical documents, it also includes the parts themselves or any representation of the parts. Controlled technical information is the other category of CUI. It is basically all the information that's on the DoD contract that is technical in nature, not publicly available, and is not ITAR. Technical information, controlled technical information includes research and engineering data, engineering drawings, associated lists, specifications, standards, process sheets, manuals, technical reports, technical orders, catalog item identifications, data sets, studies and analysis, and related information, as well as computer software, executable code, and source code. All of these things would be controlled technical information if they are not publicly available. For instance, say we have a mil-spec bolt that you can find the specifications for on the internet without restrictions. Then the mil-spec bolt and the technical specifications for that mil-spec bolt are not controlled technical information, CUI, or ITAR. If the bolt is used as part of an end assembly for a military application and the specifications have restrictions and are not publicly available, then the bolt and technical specifications for that bolt are CUI under controlled technical information and could even be ITAR. The reason why is because that particular bolt is not publicly available without restrictions. So how do I know if it's CUI? We call these run rules. If I receive a document and I need to ask myself some important questions. Does the document include technical data for the part? Does the document specifically include distribution restriction statements or stamps? Does the document contain words like controlled, ITAR restricted, or distribution restricted? Is the document from a known contractor or project with space or military applications under a DoD contract? Is the information publicly available? Does it meet the definition of controlled technical information or ITAR controlled information, even if it has no markings or indicators? For the CFR, if the document meets the definition of CUI, it must be treated like CUI. Let's go through a quick example. I received a technical drawing from a U.S. government military contractor for a military program. The technical drawing is not publicly available, and my contract terms include the DFARS 7012 clause. The technical drawing meets one of the definitions of CUI, but is missing the proper markings. The technical drawing on the left does include the engineering table, which is common. The engineering table includes the program name, the prime contractor, the part number associated with the contract for traceability, and it even has a table revision history, as well as it contains a distribution restriction code on it. What this boils down to is that the technical drawing is not publicly available and it's for a military program. So I know it's controlled technical information, but when I look at the data table closely, I notice that there's an ITAR label. I look to see if there's a distribution restriction statement, but I don't see it. What do I need to do? Just like the picture on the right-hand side, I need to add the CUI/SP-CTI label that I got off CUISupply.com and add the word controlled to meet DODI 5200.48 policy. My contract won't allow me to use the drawing, so I add a cover sheet with the distribution restriction statement and place the document in a lock cabinet in a controlled environment that contains signage that indicates the area has CUI. When the technical drawing is removed from the lock cabinet, the cover sheet needs to go with it. One thing to mention, if I had a packet of drawings for a given part, I do not need a cover sheet for every drawing in that packet. I just have to make sure the cover sheet goes along with the technical drawing packet itself. What happens if we create CUI? According to DODI 5800.48, the authorized holder of a document or material is responsible for determining at the time of creation whether information in a document or material falls into a CUI category. If so, the authorized holder is responsible for applying CUI markings and dissemination instructions accordingly. So you have to mark CUI when you create it, and you have to tell other people that it is CUI and it must be handled accordingly. Suppose I receive a drawing from a prime contractor for a part and I make the part and additional drawings for the part, but I need to send the part to one of my subcontractors for a special coding process. Not only do I need to create all the proper markings for the part and drawings, I have to ensure that my subcontractor is compliant with DFARS 7012 and soon CMMC as well. You may need to call your subcontractors or even do a site visit to verify they are compliant and that they know how to handle and protect the CUI they receive from you. You should also include these requirements in your terms and conditions with your subcontractors because you should expect your prime contractors to do the same with you. As I've mentioned before, this also applies to the manufactured CUI parts. Customer parts should be secured, controlled, and restricted from access to only authorized personnel. Only eligible, qualified, authorized, and trained personnel should be in possession of CUI parts. CUI parts will only be closely observed, handled, or received by authorized personnel. Do not allow restricted visitors or unauthorized persons to access customer parts, data, or documents. The CUI parts need to be segregated from commercial parts. You have to make sure CUI parts are properly marked. You have to make sure that people who are not authorized to access CUI are not accessing CUI, and this includes visitors. All of the relative documents that are related to CUI, such as your non-destructive testing procedures, quality assurance documentation, as well as assembly and usage manuals, must be treated as CUI and should be part of the CUI packet with the cover sheet. Once I have properly designated and marked CUI as being CUI, how do these responsibilities translate to the rest of the organization? All employees are responsible for safeguarding CUI, regardless of whether they are authorized to access CUI. All employees need to know what CUI is and why they are authorized to handle CUI and why they, or vice versa, why they aren't. If I'm purple, then I need to know what CUI is and how to handle and safeguard it. If I'm not purple, then I need to know what CUI is and what the indicators of CUI are so I know to avoid it. Keep in mind that your employees can be purple for some projects and not purple for other projects. Also remember that you have to have a lawful government purpose to access each piece of CUI. So just because a visitor might be authorized to handle CUI in their business, they most likely will not have a lawful government purpose to access your CUI. This applies to organizational facilities, sensitive data and documents, customer parts, and company information technology infrastructure. This is why we are supposed to implement all the purple CUI markings throughout the organization. So everyone will know where CUI exists so they can avoid the areas, cabinets, machines, computers, thumb drives, and any other locations that may contain the CUI. The reality is that employee errors, omissions, and behavior represent 90% of our cybersecurity risk, especially when we talk about compromises outside of data in the non-virtual world. This could be things like employees allowing unauthorized visitors to access prohibited company facilities, compromises or disclosure of corporate sensitive data, leaving machines or phones unlocked, or just having malicious or negligent insiders within your organization. This is why it's so important that everyone within the organization receives proper CUI handling and safeguarding training. And I know there's a lot here, but I promise you, if you just take baby steps up this mountain, you can successfully implement these controls and contribute to this national security mission. And that's what all of this really is. All of this is not a wish list or a goal set by the US government. It is absolutely a critical mission that is a top priority, and the US government will not fail at this objective. They have already added over 90% of these controls to DFARS 7012 that you self-attest to, and with the CMMC, they're going to do a physical site visit and absolutely verify that all the controls are in place and being properly executed. All employees must understand these policies and procedures as well as know how to enforce them. They need to know how and when to restrict access to company facilities and sensitive data. They need to understand the methods our adversaries use in order to compromise passwords and network assets that contain CUI. Employees have to understand that when these bad things happen, that it's okay and expected for them to report it. This isn't a witch hunt. This isn't the US government out to get you. It's the law that we have to report all breaches, because the only way to safeguard the company, our jobs, and ultimately our warfighting capability is to know when these bad things have happened. And remember that safeguarding CUI impacts the entire organization and not just the information technology arena. You are not successful just because of your IT team. You are not successful, you are successful because everyone across your organization takes part in the flow of information through receiving, handling, using, and creating sensitive data. All departments of your organization have a responsibility in this effort, and they are expected to understand their role. Handling CUI really does impact everyone in your organization. You have to be able to identify it, designate it, mark it, cover it, inventory it, label it, encrypt it, secure it, restrict it, control it, monitor it, ship it, and destroy it. By doing these things properly, you really can and will make a difference in securing our national interests as well as your company's competitive advantage by securing your intellectual property. I included some of the key takeaways from today's discussion on this slide. I'll go through them real quick with you. There is not an official CMMC go-live date established at this time, and that is because CMMC is still going through the federal rule-making process, and that process will be open for public comment in Q4 2020. Get ahead of CMMC by meeting the requirements of DFARS 7012, which includes NIST 800-171. The CMMC accreditation body will release the assessment guide in late September or most likely in early October 2020. Expect the rule for the CMMC requirement to be adopted by DoD as soon as it is written to the FAR. Know the difference between controlled technical information and ITAR. CMMC will impact the entire organization, not just IT infrastructure. Know when and how to authorize lawful government purpose. Know the reasonable expectation rule for CUI. Review 32 CFR 2002. Review DODI 5200.48 policy. Review NARA's ISO marking guidance documentation. And CUI marking and physical access control to CUI areas is mandated by DoD right now. And I also wanted to provide you with some useful links that I included on this one of these last slides here. I included the link to the CMMC AB. I included links to all of these CMMC websites where you can find, NIST and all the different documentation that they have available. I listed the CUI registry, link to CUI supply where you can find all the CUI marking labels, and you can get the marking labels from the GSA. But it's my understanding that there's about a 4 to 6 month wait on that order. So, and they're really not any cheaper through the GSA. So you can get them immediately from CUI supply. And that's kind of what I recommend you to do if you're wanting to get ahead of this thing. I provide a link to the DFARS 7012 clause so you can become more familiar with it, as well as all the NIST 800-171 documentation, the website where you report cyber incidents to DoD. There's a link to 32 CFR 2002, as well as NARA's ISO marking guidance, which is critical with respect on how to properly mark all these documents. And lastly, there's a link to DODI 5200.48 policy. And that is all I have for you today. Please go ahead and let me know what questions you have. I'm more than happy to answer any of them. And I'm not really seeing any questions in the chat box. So if you do not have any questions today, but want to discuss something in the future, please send us an email. And you can email us at tgi@coxinet.net, or you can give us a call at 405-329-5542, and we'll be more than happy to talk about anything that you want to talk about. Thank you to everyone, and have a great and safe day.